My name is Tyler Stovall, and I am Dean of the Humanities at UC Santa Cruz and a professor of history as well. And we wanted to have a discussion today about the issue of the pandemic. It's a program called Questions That Matter in the Time of Pandemic. And we're specifically going to be looking at questions of freedom and race and how they interact in today's climate of COVID-19. I wanted to start off with an anecdote that some of you may have heard of. A couple days ago, an Asian American CBS News reporter, Weijia Jiang, was in a press conference with President Trump, and she asked him a question, and he responded by saying, "Why don't you go ask China?" So after a moment of shock, she asked him, "Why are you asking me that?" And then he ended the news conference. So this speaks to some of the issues we're going to be looking at today. How questions of race and how questions of freedom have interacted in how we deal with America's reaction to dealing with the pandemic. I am joined today by three esteemed and distinguished colleagues from the Humanities Division, Professor Christine Hong of Literature, and Professors Alice Yang and Noriko Aso of the History Department. So we are going to be exploring this issue. Before we do, I would like to share a few details about our event tonight. First of all, the event is being recorded and will be available on the Humanities Institute website. It's something that has all sorts of information, and I encourage that you visit it to find more about this particular event as well. We are using a webinar tool. So tonight there is no chat function for those of you who wish to ask questions. On the other hand, please use the Q&A function at the top of your screen, the Q&A tool, to ask us questions throughout our discussion. We will do our best to field questions as they come in, and we will also leave time at the end for more questions and answers. So, as I said a moment ago, the theme of tonight's discussion is freedom and race. This is a topic that the Humanities Institute explored in 2018 at the Institute's signature event called Questions That Matter, held at the Kumba Jazz Center. Many of the issues we talked about then are still relevant today, and many respects have been highlighted and intensified by the coronavirus pandemic. So I just wanted to say a few words about that before then leading off with questions for our distinguished professors here today. The whole issue of freedom has been very directly posed in an era which, as we have observed, so much of America seems to be under house arrest, where the ability of Americans to leave their homes, to go to stores, to go out shopping or entertainment venues has been strictly restricted by government decisions. In the last few weeks, a powerful movement of protest against those restrictions has arisen. Starting in states like Tennessee and Michigan, and then sweeping the country, including here in California. Protesters have attacked the infringements upon their freedom, have demanded that government restrictions be loosened, that they have the right to do what they wish, and see it as a movement against government autocracy. One of the interesting aspects of this movement is that it has been almost entirely white, mostly in white parts of the country, mostly, although not entirely, in fairly rural parts of the country. The areas of the country that have had less impact from the coronavirus pandemic than have urban areas. And many of the participants in these marches and demonstrations have used explicit references to race, ranging from displaying Confederate flags, for example, to displaying swastikas, to blaming the pandemic on immigrants, especially, but not only, Asian immigrants or Asians in general in the United States. So there's a way in which the idea of freedom, which is cherished by these demonstrators, also has a strong racial underpinning, also is strongly tied to people's image of themselves as white and to the idea of white privilege. And this is one of the things we want to explore today. One of the ironies, of course, is that many people see the virus as having originated from elsewhere, and elsewhere usually means from Asia. Phrases like the Wuhan virus, or my favorite, the Kung flu, have been very popular among these kinds of demonstrators. At the same time, their attacks on measures taken by governments to restrict the spread of the coronavirus tend to neglect the fact that the most victimized communities by the virus tend to be Black and brown communities. So it is something that many of these demonstrators are attacking, means to protect people of color in the name of preserving and defending freedom. So I think our panel today will look at these questions. How do freedom and how do visions of the other interact in America's attempts to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, and how they shape how we look at it? So I wanted to raise a few questions with my colleagues, and I wanted to start off with Professor Christine Hong, I'm sorry. Christine, one of the questions that has arisen is the whole vision of the struggle against the coronavirus as a war against the pandemic, and that ultimately raises the question of not only are we using the war metaphor and how appropriate is that war, but in any war situation, the question is a war against whom? A war not just against the virus, but who represents the virus in this kind of discourse. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's true. Trump outright stated that we are fighting an invisible enemy. He has declared himself something of a war president. And, but as you say, there's a face that has been given to this virus, and it draws upon a long legacy of anti-Asian sentiment, and particularly anti-Chinese sentiment, that inaugurated this nation as a gatekeeping nation. And you could say that Trump using the term the Chinese virus is something of an election year wag the dog politics. But the question of war is interesting because at the same time that he's nominating this virus the Chinese virus, he's also goading his supporters on by telling them to storm these various capitals and to liberate them, right? So there's this notion of white freedom that you were mentioning. And the question is, when they're storming the capitals with weapons, with guns, what is their war against, right? And, but as you say, there's an entire spectrum of anti-Chinese sentiment that has manifested. It could be something like being spat upon, being Asian American and spat upon in the street. It could be a comment on a news article, China's got to pay, right? Something along those lines. And, it's really, there's a kind of that, there's also something else too, which is this long history of conflating the Chinese specifically with disease. And so there's something about that we are seeing a kind of reactionary resurgence of. There's a new reporting center, it's called Stop AAPI Hate. And that reporting center, for the first couple of weeks of April alone, recorded something like 1,200 incidents of racial harassment and violence in the United States. But I think that it's interesting to take the question of war further. There have been a host of total war analogies that hark back from World War II to describe what we all need to do for the broader social good. There's a sense that we all have to do our part, including submit to the suspension of our usual freedoms in order to unite in the face of this quote unquote invisible enemy. And people are doing things like victory gardens. To some degree, there's a kind of minor rationing that's going on. But I think that whenever wars are declared against amorphous, objectless targets, we can think of the war on drugs, the war on terror, there's always collateral damage. There are always demographics that are being targeted. Mm-hmm. So one question that we have to ask is, who's being allowed to die? There are decisions that are being made about survival right now. And there's a sense that some will have to die in order for this to be a functioning capitalist economy. But the United States is based on racial capitalism. And we see those fault lines exacerbated now. So who uncoincidentally is on the front lines? Who is doing low-wage healthcare work? Who's doing agricultural work? Who's doing service industry jobs? It's disproportionately migrant workers. It's disproportionately Black and brown people. And Black and brown people are also most likely to get arrested right now. And so there's this sense that essential is really a code term for expendable. And I want to say one other thing too. I'm someone who researches war and empire. And, when something is nominated the Chinese virus and, there's a war that is sort of informally declared, it's also the case that we can't lose sight of the actual wars that haunt and saturate this moment. So at the moment that, Trump is calling this a Chinese virus, it's also the case that the United States has deployed nuclear powered aircraft carriers to the South China Seas. I mean, this we cannot lose sight of. And so the 70th year of the ongoing, as yet unresolved Korean War, this was an asymmetrical war of US aggression in which an estimated 4 million Koreans, the vast majority civilian, were killed. We just have hints of this. So people mentioned the Defense Production Act of 1950, really calling upon Trump to use it to order different companies to produce PPE. But people don't think about the unfree history behind the DPA. Basically, the Korean War authorized the national security state. It also authorized an expansion of the US empire of bases throughout Asia and the Pacific. It crystallized the military-industrial complex. It gave McCarthyism its long run. It placed this country on permanent war footing. The other thing too I just want to mention is that for countries like Iran and North Korea, the United States has leveled an incredible regime of sanctions against these countries. And these sanctions are meant to create and to cause humanitarian catastrophe. So when we think about war as a metaphor, we have to realize that it maps on to actual US interventionist policy that amounts to untold numbers of dead on the sideline. I want to also say one last thing. South Korea keeps getting resurrected or held up as a kind of model during our times. South Korea has really done extraordinarily invasive contact tracing. And that, against the fact that there is a Cold War era national security law that allows for incredible sort of persecution of South Koreans. It's one of the most undemocratic features of the South Korean government. That, coupled with this capacity to mass surveil the population, we have to ask ourselves, is that a model that we want?
Okay, thank you, Professor Hong. I'd like to bring in Professor Alice Zhang and Professor Noriko Aso to see if they have any responses or reactions to your observations.
Well, one thing that I'd like to add, Christine was talking about how essential workers can be a code name for people who are low-wage migrant workers, people in the healthcare industry, people in factories, right, or in grocery stores. I think, part of the reason why African-American and Latino and Latinx communities are so impacted is also because of problematic health insurance, right? They're not covered, especially in the case of migrant and undocumented workers, right? They don't have access to it. There's a fear. And so as a result, right, they're also more vulnerable to the disease because of things like hypertension, heart disease, diabetes. Not having those underlying conditions get treated means that once they are vulnerable to it, right, they're much more likely to have very serious cases. And that's part of why not only do they have more cases compared to their percentages in the population, but they also have more deaths, right? So when Christine was talking about expendability, I think we really have to look at our healthcare and our health insurance as a major problem in terms of some of the disparities that we're seeing, as well as, the questions about systemic and institutionalized racism and poverty, right? That also causes them to be more likely to be homeless, to be in overcrowded and, you know, living conditions where they can't practice the social distancing that's been recommended.
Yeah, let me just build upon that and referencing the fact that the ability to engage in healthy practices is also something that is discriminatory. We just witnessed a Black man being shot to death for jogging through a white neighborhood.
Yep.
Jogging is a healthy activity, supposed to be, although it wasn't in this case. Professor Aso.
Yeah, I just, I wanted to sort of, I don't know, maybe reframe a little bit in terms of one of the things that has worried me in the coverage of Asia in dealing with COVID-19 is the way Asia gets collapsed into China by and large and into being a sort of monolithic authoritarian surveillance state kind of model. And so that's sort of presented as, okay, that's one choice. It's effective Singapore. It's effective, but the cost is freedom. And then, you know, sort of it plays into very persistent stereotypes about Asians as being, you know, sort of following the herd and, you know, not being democratic, being fairly unchanged in the Washington Post on Japan, which is my specialty, and coronavirus. And it kind of cracked me up how the articles are the articles that you always see about Japan, only plus coronavirus. So there's an article about robots, and there's an article about hostess bars and coronavirus. It's pretty funny. And so, you know, we see sort of the habits in mass media sort of being put together, right, with this particular historical moment. And I think that kind of, what I feel like I'm seeing is sort of adding up to, it's either Asia or the United States, and Asia is authoritarian and the United States is freedom. And so that we have nothing to learn, right, from what people in Asia are doing. And therefore, you know, that can all be excluded. Whereas, you know, the responses in Asia have been pretty varied. And, you know, even if we're talking about authoritarian responses, South Korea has been different from the PRC in various ways. PRC has been a little bit more sort of overt policing. South Korea has been more sort of the high-tech, you know, tracing and the sort of apps that can trace people by phones and all that, right? So sort of different scenarios. And then Japan, again, is sort of the weird one in that one of the big arguments was that lockdown was anti-constitutional, and this was the position of the state, which is by no means a sort of sort of wild-eyed liberal left state. Okay, it's actually a very conservative state, but they were saying, oh, it's anti-constitution, it's against the Constitution, and therefore we can't impose a lockdown, or at least enforce a lockdown. And so then a special sort of temporary law was passed that it was along the lines of our previous emergency measures laws passed for one of the earlier pandemics. And, you know, so you know, the sort of the constitutionality of all of this has been at the forefront in the discussions in Japan. And, you know, if you know, unlike cherry blossoms in the Washington Post, what a lot of newspapers in Japan are now really concerned about is the government's attempt to extend its control over sort of the appointment of prosecutors in the judicial system. And so, you know, you have all these celebrities writing against that as well. So, you know, it's playing out differently in different places. And we're also seeing at this point that there's not one successful model, really. Like Singapore was supposed to be the big success until it wasn't, right? And part of why it wasn't was because of the kinds of things that Christine and Alice and you, Tyler, have been mentioning, that the sort of the contact and sort of health practices, or, you know, sort of measures for health that are available to certain parts of the population, right? These are not evenly distributed. And so in this case, migrant workers in Singapore were neglected And that's where this new sort of outbreak emerged, right? So basically, I think what I would try to make a plea for is not so much pose it purely in terms of freedom and unfreedom, but going a little bit more pragmatic. I mean, I think we want to protect our freedoms and push back against, authoritarian moves made by, many different governments, Turkey for one. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing to learn from Asia or there's nothing to learn from other parts of the world, right? We can, I think, hopefully have a little bit more of maybe a piecemeal, but very pragmatic sort of approach to dealing with, and probably more local, and a more local model, and one that is very attentive to the unevenness, right? Because when you say free, like the protests that you talked about, that sort of, really clearly map their choice of the word freedom onto white privilege. Often they're arguing about sort of the freedom to, consume, right? The freedom to get a haircut. And there are other freedoms that we can certainly pose against that. And the freedom to consume has been framed in terms often in more sort of moralistic terms as the freedom to go to work. But then that gets us back to what you all have been bringing up in terms of it's not even in terms of who's going back to work or who's been an essential worker all along. So what about the freedom of these workers to not have to encounter conditions as they go to work? I mean, this is equally, if not more important, a freedom as simply the ability to move around or to purchase. So that's my plea.
Okay. Well, thank you, Noriko. That was very rich. I mean, one of the things I would say, just in reaction to your last statement, was that many people in American society, in capitalist society, will push back at that and say that, well, if workers don't want to be infected with the job, they have the right not to take the job and to go somewhere else to work. It's like the French king who said, His Majesty equally forbids the wealthy and the poor from sleeping on park benches, right?
But that's where we could be more pragmatic, right? And instead of getting sort of in this ideological lock, because a number of countries are actually paying workers to stay home. And I think that's a very elegant solution, because people should have the freedom to not work under circumstances like this. But of course, that means the freedom to not have to pay utilities or a mortgage or rent, and things like that for a certain amount of time. So long as we're under these emergency circumstances, then that really should be across the board, not just on the backs of essential workers and healthcare workers.
Okay, well, I wanted to move on to Alice, but before that, we have a couple of comments that I wanted to read from our audience. Richard Hogan writes in, obviously, Democrats and others, young people and people of color, are the targets. The old and the sick will die in the interest of re-electing the president. If young people and people of color vote, Trump will not be elected. Hence, they must be killed or intimidated, so they will not vote. Okay, so that's one perspective. Another person writes in, Claire Warshaw, what about Taiwan? I recently read they were doing well with the pandemic in comparison to China. Is that true? Noriko, maybe you can comment on that. So, and thank you for those observations, and please keep on writing in. But I want to go now to Alice Yang and pose a question to her. Professor Yang, how do we understand the racism, the scapegoating, and the xenophobia we're witnessing now from a historical perspective? This is not the first pandemic in world history. It's not the first pandemic in American history. So what do we learn from how other eras have dealt with these kinds of questions?
Thank you, Tyler. That's a great question. And the website that Christine mentioned, the Stop AAPI Hate, it started on March 19th, and actually over 4 weeks they had over 1,500 incidents, hate incidents. And that, as Christine mentioned, right, that can be verbal abuse, it can be people spitting, but there have actually been some very horrific cases of violence, right? A woman in Brooklyn who was taking out her garbage and had acid thrown on her face and arms and suffered second-degree burns. There was a 16-year-old boy in the San Fernando Valley who got beaten up because he was Asian American and they assumed that he had COVID and he had to be hospitalized. And then in Midland, Texas, there was a family that was shopping at a Sam's Club store, and they got attacked, including a 2-year-old who was stabbed and had to be hospitalized. So, we're, in some of these cases, we see extreme violence. And I do worry that when the shelter-in-place orders are lifted or when people defy them, we will have an uptick again in that kind of scapegoating of people, blaming them for the disease, attacking them. But as a historian, unfortunately, this is nothing new. And it's not just Asian migrants or Asian Americans who have suffered this, although right now they're bearing the brunt of it. Right? I know you've written about how, the anti-Semitism that took place during the Middle Ages when Jews were blamed for the Black Death. In the United States, they were blamed for tuberculosis in the 19th century, right? And it's also affected other groups of so-called dangerous foreigners, right? In 1832, there was a cholera outbreak in New York, and Irish immigrants, in that case, were blamed because they were perceived as the dangerous foreigners. And so what we see is a long history where in times of crisis, when people are afraid, insecure, but especially concerned about disease, they look to blame the dangerous foreign outsider. And unfortunately, in the case of Asian Americans, who in many cases are 5th generation or more, right, they're always perceived as the perpetual foreigner, right? It doesn't matter how long your family has lived in the United States, if you have an Asian face, right? When the outbreak first came out, people just assumed anyone with an Asian face might be from Wuhan and might therefore be a carrier. And sadly, it's with the anti-Chinese movement, there were massacres in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885. There was a massacre or a mass lynching that a lot of people don't know about in 1871 in Los Angeles, where a mob basically heard that a rancher had been shot and killed by a Chinese immigrant and basically had a mass lynching of between 17 and 20 people. And they displayed their bodies at 3 different sites without any sort of interference by the authorities. And even more recently, right, I'm going to recommend, actually, maybe I'll just do it now. There's a great PBS series called Asian Americans that has been spearheaded by Renee Tajima Pena, who some of our alumni may remember because she was a professor in the film and digital media program here before she went to UCLA, and she is an Oscar-nominated director who, for the documentary with Christine Choi called Who Killed Vincent Chin, which showed how in the 1980s, as the economy declined, as the Detroit auto industry experienced mass layoffs, right, and unemployment, a 27-year-old Chinese-American engineer got murdered with a baseball bat. And in that case, the 2 assailants pled guilty to manslaughter, but only had to pay a $3,000 fine. And it caused a resurgence of Asian American activism as people began to realize, right, that he was attacked, even though he was Chinese American, because it was assumed that he was Japanese, and the auto workers were blaming Japan, right? There was a climate of anti-Japanese sentiment where people would bash Japanese cars. There were cases of Japanese cars getting shot at, right? And so in that case, that was a fairly recent wake-up call to the Asian American community that they had to mobilize. And as a result of that activism, right, we had hate crime legislation so that if the perpetrator was influenced by their perception of the victim, right, and it was racially based, that could factor into the sentencing. And so that was a major change that happened as a result. And Vincent Chin's case is profiled again in this series, but it looks at a much longer history of Asian American migration, attacks, discrimination, right, ranging from immigration exclusion to the denial of naturalization rights, and basically how different groups of Asian Americans, you know, in one segment of the program, have been victimized and scapegoated as dangerous and foreign and deserving of being ostracized within the American community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that, Alice. I'm going to ask Christine and Noriko to respond, but I also wanted to read. We have some more questions coming in. One person asks, Jeffrey Cirillo asks, so would you choose freedom over the health of a person that may be infected by that freedom? And this goes to the question of how do we deal with freedom and its restrictions? And let me just read another question or a comment. One critique I've heard is that there is too much media coverage of the anti-quarantine protests and not equal media coverage of the labor strikes taken by, quote, essential workers complaining of overwork, lack of protections, and other considerations during the strike. For example, LULAC's push for a meatless May. What do you think of this critique? So I'd love to get your responses to those questions and also to Alice's observations.
I'll just say there was a Vox media article about the differential protest, coverage of the protest, and it very clearly showed that there's been much larger protests by essential workers for in strikes and the like, and they simply haven't been covered.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I've also noticed that as well. I mean, there has been such undue coverage given to the white nationalists, anti-vaxxers, et cetera, who've stormed various capitals. And I think that it's also interesting to note that there's also been instances of Republican governors trying to force, road access through American Indian reservations. And then that really does, and American Indian reservations have been disproportionately hit in outsized ways, relative to the population, even more so than New York City. And that really does crystallize the question of a racialized notion of freedom over the collective health of a community.
Okay, thank you both for that. Do either of you have any further responses to Alice's discussion of the history of these kinds of racial movements around pandemics? Yeah. I mean, have we come a long way, maybe, or maybe not so much?
Well, I would say based on a lot of the media coverage, maybe not so much. I mean, we still see a lot of very, very sort of archetypal Cold War rhetoric. I was looking at, an opinion piece by Kathleen Parker, and she was resurrecting, again, sort of China is the big enemy, and how do we deal with it? And we've been naive, and the U.S. has been naive and lax, and therefore it needs to toughen up and take on the world domination ambitions of China. And it's like what we hear over and over and over again, right? And I was thinking when Alice was mentioning the PBS documentary that one of the things I really like about that documentary is it actually takes, well, first of all, there's many different kinds of Asian Americans who are represented, right? And they're all, not all put in one basket. There's a lot of distinctly different sets of experiences. And she, the documentary tries to show sort of diversity of experience even within, say, the Japanese American community during the internment camps of World War II, about which Alice can say much more. So, the sort of that range of things, but also from the very first episode, the documentary doesn't put things in just a white Asian dialogue, that actually, sort of African-American connections and sort of different sets of communities are put into relationship. And I think that's a really great way to expand the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well,
I was just going to say, just to follow up on some of the comments that both you and Noriko made, it's interesting to think about how this is a moment in which you know, Asian Americans, and, you know, immigration historians like May Nye say that the term Asian has to be understood in many ways as a uniquely American construction in terms of the conflationary work that it does, right? But it's interesting that this is a moment in which we are made to internalize dominant anxiety. And I'm thinking about a report that was done on patient 0 in New Jersey. He's a Chinese American healthcare worker. And he spoke about being, he ended up coming down with, of course, you know, coronavirus. And he was very, very close to dying. And he wrote about the fact that he was extremely vigilant about all of his sort of personal hygiene practices. But then in the early days of the outbreak, after it was declared to be, well, maybe not so early, after it was declared by WHO to be a pandemic, he felt anxious about wearing his mask in the streets. And so in his commute to and from work, he abandoned the mask because he didn't want to be an Asian wearing a mask, you know, in a public commute. And he feels that that was the moment that he came down with it. But the other part of the story that is very interesting is that because he was part of a transnational community with links to the Chinese medical establishment, he was able to garner so much information, documents that were translated, and all of this actually aided his own healthcare.
Well, and to add to that, you know, 17% of the doctors in this country are supposedly of Asian descent. So there are a lot of healthcare workers that, you know, are on both battlefronts, right? They're battling the disease, but they also have to worry about protecting themselves. And unfortunately, when they go out in the street, they have to worry about possibly being targeted. The one thing that I will say is that, you know, while we see these hate incidents happening, we also see more protests and more stories by Asian American journalists, even if they suffer discrimination by our president, and, you know, politicians who have taken a stand against this, right? Most notably Judy Chu, the congresswoman from Monterey Park, Mazie Hirono, Tammy Duckworth, right? They've all called for investigations from the U.S. Commission on Human Rights to investigate some of the anti-Asian violence here. And, you know, even with the murder of Vincent Chen in 1982, right? You saw a multiracial coalition develop attacking hate crimes that included Jesse Jackson denouncing the murder of Vincent Chen. And after 9/11, when people who were viewed as Middle Eastern or Muslim, right, got attacked, including people who were Sikh, most famously Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was a gas station owner in Mesa, Arizona, or who got attacked and killed, right, because he was perceived as a possible terrorist, even though he was a Sikh, right? You saw multiracial coalitions develop, and you saw people protesting this, and people protesting the detention of people who were from Pakistan, right, who were put in indefinite detention. So I do think that while we still see the hate crimes and the hate incidents, we also see people much more willing to protest and come together to defend what are really core American values.
Okay. Thank you all. We have we have a lot of questions now, so I'm going to try and go back to them. One person writes in and asks, let's see, the protesters assert their right to liberty, but there is no discussion of the responsibilities of citizenship. It seems to me that protecting the health of our fellow citizens is one of those responsibilities, and the writer would like your thoughts.
I think that's absolutely true, right? I mean, people who are wearing masks, unless they're using the medical mask, which we're not supposed to be using, right? Those masks are really not so much to protect you from COVID-19 as to prevent you from spreading it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
there's this inherent, you know, we live in Santa Cruz, and I see people who are very polite about practicing social distancing, but there is this consciousness that you have a duty to try to protect other people, even if you're asymptomatic, right? That's the unfortunate aspect of this disease, that you can be quite contagious before you know that you have any symptoms, or before you can even exhibit any symptoms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, one of the historical analogies or ironies I like to think of in this kind of context is the whole idea of the military draft, because it is often billed in America as your service and protection of freedom. But of course, the whole idea of conscription is a temporary denial of freedom to individuals, right? And yet I think very few people would argue that armed service is authoritarian, right? And therefore should not be respected as part of the cause for freedom. Let me read a couple of more questions, and then I want to go back to Noriko. Let's see. One person writes, freedom keeps getting distorted as First Amendment, as the First Amendment going into. And another person writes, and he says this is a provocation of sorts. To what extent do you think the net results of these trends in the US are genocidal? Purposeful or not, but Alice mentioned the pogroms in Europe and mass lynchings in the US, which encouraged me to ask a bit more directly about the extent to which you all might want to talk about the idea of accidental or incidental genocide. So any reactions to either of those questions?
Tyler, could I respond to your
Sure.
comment about the draft?
Sure.
You know, and just military service in general, and, you know, the sort of idea of a kind of suspension of some freedoms for the national good. You know, I mean, that is something that I actually look at to some degree in my own research.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at, you know, the first federal institution to be desegregated. It was not education. It wasn't Brown versus Board of Education. It was the US military.
Right.
And it was the US military, and it wasn't just Truman's 1948 order. I mean, that executive order was one thing, but that was realized on the battlegrounds of Korea. And so, I mean, that is a kind of question that, you know, Black radicals, including people like Paul Robeson and others, they, you know, people who were involved in the Civil Rights Congress, which was an organization that was red baited out of existence, you know, for protesting the Korean War in Madison Square Garden on June 27th or 28th of 1950. Paul Robeson had his passport taken away by the State Department. And, you know, the fact of the matter was that the integration of US forces on the battlefield was one way of announcing to the world a certain kind of liberal face of the United States on the global stage. You know, Barack Obama in 2013, in front of the Korean War Memorial in the National Mall, he said that the Korean War paved the way. He framed the Korean War as a kind of vanguard in terms of civil rights. He said if African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, and white Americans could fight shoulder to shoulder over there, we certainly could be integrated over here. And he said that the lesson of the Korean War was that the United States had to remain the world's greatest military power, bar none, always. But there's something profoundly illiberal to that kind of military, multicultural message as well. And when you think about these interventionist wars, you know, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, US-backed interventions in Central America throughout, you know, the Cold War, when you think about these kinds of wars, and then the War on Terror, so-called War on Terror, where the death toll, what John Terman refers to as the unknown, unquantifiable deaths of others, the deaths of others speaks volumes about how illiberal, how undemocratic those wars are too. And I think that that invites us to think critically about sort of military opportunities for multiculturalism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. So we have more questions, but I want to turn to Noriko before we run out of time. And, you know, partly you've done this already, but I wanted you to talk a bit more about Asian stereotypes from the perspective of somebody who studies Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and has already made the point that there are many different types of countries in Asia, right? And many different types of Asian peoples.
Right.
So.
Yeah, well, I mean, thinking about some of the coverage that I've seen, just briefly going back to Japan, there was an article about bullying in sort of the age of COVID-19. And, you know, at one point there's a paragraph about how, you know, in feudal Japan, there was discrimination against, you know, these various groups. And, you know, that sort of quick turn toward feudal Japan somehow explains everything. It's just, again, there's a lot of those gestures. The coverage of China in particular was on my mind because I'm teaching a Cold War in East Asia seminar right now. And so, you know, we've been looking at the Cold War rhetoric around China, the containment of China, the loss of China, all of these things. And so the students were, you know, quick to pick up on sort of the recurrence of these various terms. There was a question much earlier about Taiwan and the coronavirus stuff, and I don't know as much. I mean, mostly the coverage that I've seen has been stressing, you know, again, that it's sort of a science-based approach to, you know, dealing with the pandemic. But I had just been reading an article about actually Hong Kong. That was really interesting too. And, you know, I think the way I would mentally link this back to some of the stuff that you guys are talking about is Hong Kong is a really fraught situation right now, right? So we've been seeing protesters, massive numbers of protesters, trying to push back on sort of the reach of the PRC and its attempt to, you know, seriously infringe on various rights of the people of Hong Kong. So you already have this ongoing protest. And then when coronavirus sort of enters into the mix, what happened is some of these protester networks actually got activated to have sort of a people's response to the pandemic. So there was these mask brigades, you know, sort of the protesters were handing out masks. And there were, you know, there's been a lot of critique of state response, you know, from the protesters as well. And what was the other? Oh, there was a strike on the part of medical workers actually to close the borders between Hong Kong and the PRC rather early on. So, you know, it's playing out differently in different places, right? In Asia, there's not one model. And yet, like, Hong Kong is not just a happy story, right? The shadow of PRC authoritarianism definitely looms over all of this. And there's a sort of push and pull, right? There's sort of attempt to push back on authoritarian measures and at the same time mobilize to combat this disease and, you know, to exercise that kind of respect for others, right? That you and Alice were talking about, and one of the people who wrote in, that freedom shouldn't be seen as simply, you know, about the self, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, let me just, thank you for that. I wanted to follow up with another question, which banks on something you said earlier, and this is the image of Asians as not free, in effect. Yeah. That Asian culture is not a free culture in the same way that white culture is. That, you know, and this applies not just to Asians, but Asian Americans as well, right? That Asian Americans tend to be more regimented, that part of their success is precisely to this, in effect, lack of freedom. And I'd love to get your guys' comments on that.
I think that go ahead.
No, please go.
I just wanted to make a kind of quick and fast observation, because what we're talking about right now is a pandemic, and it's such a strange proposition to be discussing freedom in the abstract without a sense of the consequences, the social consequences of doing the usual things that you might do. And I think that, you know, this is just one thing that it's just my quick and fast observation. It's that at Santa Cruz, we have a lot of international students from many different countries in Asia. And it has been, you know, to no small degree, a recruitment strategy of American universities to recruit Asian students, graduate students, some undergraduate students as well. And many of those students have gone home, and I've been in touch with many of my students on a regular basis. And I have to say that and I'll look at the background, like when we're Zooming, and they'll be in a cafe and people are walking behind them, and some semblance of life is going on. And, you know, it's an extraordinary thing, because people having, there being some consensus for the common good also means that people have greater freedoms to some degree. And I was going to say that for some of our students, I think that not all of them, but I think that they are somewhat askance, and their families, like in calling them home, it was partly out of some measure of horror at the public health fiasco of the United States, the chaos and the incoherence of its policy, plus the anti-Asian, in a generalizable way, sentiment. You know?
Okay.
Well, and I would add, you know, when earlier in the year, when our international students, who many of whom had some familiarity, right, because of SARS earlier, and were wearing masks, and I heard students making fun of them, right? And now, obviously, right, the situation has changed so dramatically, and everyone's wondering where they can get a mask. And seeing how these people weren't being paranoid or crazy or diseased, they were being cautious, right? Because they have that experience, and they have that knowledge from earlier. And now it's hitting here because we have not been insulated.
Okay, we only have a few minutes, so I wanted to close with one final question for everybody. What are the most effective countermeasures, and by which communities, to ameliorate the frightening trends occurring at this time in terms of this rise of bigotry and reaction to the pandemic?
You know, I think it's been very powerful to see people participating in mutual aid, sometimes on an extremely local level, but really animating that as a tradition that has a long history within communities of color. You can think about the myriad programs that were created by the Black Panther Party. You can think about Asian Health Services in Oakland. You know, I mean, these are all forms of mutual aid, and we see that being breathed life into at this moment. So it's animated in a very interesting way.
I mean, I would add to that. You brought up the killing of Ahmaud Arbery in Brunswick, Georgia, right? And Asian Americans, along with other people of color, have been very vocal in criticizing how that case has been handled. Why it took a viral video to finally get an investigation months after the attack. So I do think you see examples of solidarity where people see an injustice. And I think, you know, back to that question of genocide, I don't think that's going to happen, in part because people are more vigilant and they're more willing to speak out and denounce this. And even if you have some public officials who utter, you know, bizarre statements, right, including charging that the outbreak came from a virology lab or as a bioweapon from China, right? You get other reports countering that, and you get people denouncing it. And so that gives me more reassurance than the pogroms and the massacres that we had in the,
I
historically.
would agree with all of that. And I would just sort of add that I think taking a step backward from the action, actually, it's been a very revealing moment, right, about the various weaknesses of our social structures, healthcare, first and foremost, but at many different levels. And so that, you know, the injustices that we've gotten used to living with every day, I think have become all the more sharply underscored, and that hopefully will lead to some measures to address these problems. There's also been an interesting, you know, again, different countries have had different responses, and you know, the you know, capacity of some countries to pay the people to stay home is one that I think, you know, I wish our government would be a little bit more open to.
Okay.
Tyler, could I
Yeah.
make a plug for
Please.
an event? So on it's a Friday, May 29th at 2 p.m. The new Center for Racial Justice, in conjunction with a host of campus partners, will be holding a teach-in on anti-Asian xenophobia during a time of coronavirus. And that will feature Russell Jung, who is the chair of Asian American Studies at SF State, as well as Cynthia Chi, who is with the, she's one of the EDs with Chinese for Affirmative Action in the city. And those two were essential behind the founding of the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center. So if anyone is interested in continuing the conversation, learning more, hearing these people speak, please feel free to email me. You can just look up my contact information on the UCSC website.
Okay. Thank you, Christine. And I'm afraid we're out of time. So first of all, I want to thank our panelists, Alice Yang, Christine Hong, and Noriko Aso, for their inspired comments and their willingness to participate in this event dealing with the most important topic. I want to thank all of you in the audience, most of whom we did not get a chance to read your questions, I'm afraid, but thank you for participating. And take care, everybody. It was very useful to have you here, and be well and stay safe. Take care and, you know, be safe. Okay, goodbye.